The mountains in the Nevada Territory are very steep. And come spring snowmelt, the ground can become saturated and liquefy, therefore causing these terrible landslides. Fully half a mountain can come sliding down and end up on a nearby valley, leaving a terrible scar as evidence of that event. Now, right around 1865, the marshals of the Nevada Territory, they petitioned the federal government for a United States attorney, and in response, the government shipped out a man known as General Buncombe. Now, Buncombe fashioned himself a lawyer of sorts, and he saw this as a perfect way to manifest his legal talents. The residents of the Nevada Territory viewed outsiders with a non-malignant contempt, as long as those outsiders were seen not to be in the way. But if an outsider, such as Buncombe, was seen to be in the way, then those residents would take steps to put that outsider in his place. And so it was that Richard Sides came galloping furiously up to Buncombe's door there in Carson City, demanding that Buncombe represent him in a lawsuit. And if he was to prevail, he would be awarded the sum of $500. This was in 1865. Now, the way Sides described this was, he said, well, everybody knew that he had this farm. He'd been farming this piece of property out by a local valley. And up above on the mountainside, his neighbor, Tom Morgan, had a ranch. And come one of those landslides, and that ranch slid down the mountain fully intact. All the buildings and the fences and the animals all stayed in their same relative places. They just all come down and ended up on top of Sides' farm, burying that farm under 6 foot of mud. Well, the way Sides described this thing, he fairly wept as he described, there was like 1,000 freight trains coming down. There was this clouds of dust billowing up in front. I thought it was a judgment coming to get me for sure. But then that dust settled, and old Tom Morgan comes waltzing out of his cabin, looks around, says, well, it'd been quite a ride, but he kind of liked this new place, thought he'd stay. When I pointed out he was sitting 6 foot on top of my farm, he told me that I had given up the rights to that farm since I vacated when I saw him coming. I didn't know what to do. Here I'd lost everything, and now my neighbor, who I thought was my friend, was telling me that I didn't have no right to that very property that I'd been farming all those many years. I went out and wandered around in the bush for days, and now I'm half starved and I'm so mad I can hardly see straight. Well, Buncombe couldn't believe his ears. He couldn't believe that anybody really thought that they had a right to a piece of property just because their ranch slid down on top of it. Well, there was no lawyer worth his salt would take such a case, and there's no judge would agree to hear it. Well, that's what makes me even madder. Well, Morgan's already got himself a good local lawyer, and it's going to be heard by an ex-governor and a referee named Arup. Well, this was a perfect chance for Buncombe to prove his mettle. This case was already won. All he had to do was collect some witnesses and look at the case law. He sent Richard Sides away with perfect assurance that they would win this case. 2 p.m. on the day of the hearing, ex-Governor Roop made the following declaration. There he was, enthroned on that judge's bench. "Ladies and gentlemen, order in the court." When he heard that, Buncombe pushed his way in through those doors, his arms laden with law books. Ladies and gentlemen, make way for the United States Attorney." Oh, Buncombe had never heard his name uttered in that way. With his official title, it warmed him to the cockles of his heart. The hearing progressed. The witnesses were called. And every witness, every testimony, even those of the defendant, Tom Morgan, went in favor of the plaintiff, Richard Sides. And as Buncombe stood up to give his final argument, he could see from the eyes of everybody in that courtroom that he had won that case. He finished those final arguments, and he sat down, and then all those eyes turned toward ex-Governor Roop. Well, Roop thought for a long time, put his head in his hands. He stepped down from that bench, and he paced back and forth with long, deliberate strides. And then he re-enthroned himself back up on that bench, and he made the following declaration. Ladies and gentlemen, this is no ordinary case, but the most solemn and awful that ever a man has been asked to decide. Both lawyers have done an admirable job, but it's clear that all the testimony has gone in favor of the plaintiff, Richard Sides. Ladies and gentlemen, it is clear that the laws of man favor the plaintiff. On the other hand, we are all but worms in the eyes of heaven. And it is perfectly clear to me that heaven, in its inscrutable wisdom, has chosen to move the defendant's ranch for a reason. After all, it is heaven that created those ranches, and it's heaven's prerogative to move them around, experiment with them, and do with them as it sees fit. Ladies and gentlemen, worms as we are, we have no standing to question decisions made in heaven. And therefore, it is the decision of this court that Richard Sides, the plaintiff, has been deprived of his farm by a visitation from God. And from this decision, there is no appeal. Buncombe could not believe his ears. He gathered up his law books and he stomped out of that courtroom. He declared Roop to be a miraculous ass, a fool, an inspired idiot. He went back to his house and he threw down those books and he paced back and forth in his study, screaming bloody murder and throwing things at nothing in particular. Well, after a couple hours, exhausted and hungry, he went down to Baker's Tavern and he looked over those swinging doors. He saw inside that bar, the whole thing was filled with people from that courtroom, including Tom Morgan, the defendant. and his own client, Richard Sides, sitting together, talking together, laughing, sharing a beer together. Oh. He pushed those doors open, and the entire bar went deathly silent. Then, after a moment, ex-Governor Roop stood up and he said, we're just taking bets on how long it would take you to realize that you had been the victim of an elaborate practical joke. Here, let me buy you a beer, sir, and welcome to Carson City. And the entire bar erupted in laughter and applause. Thank you.